With the release of Metaphor Refantazio, a slew of shining endorsements all over the internet, and an ongoing war within the community, if Metaphor should even be considered a Megaten game, there's been one question the fans have been asking themselves this entire time. So, who could take a bear in a fight?
All of them.
But if you're one of the literal hundreds of people who have commented that exact question on my channel, then you must consider Metaphor at least somewhat comparable to the Persona series, which if you don't know is our bread and butter around here. And while I won't die on either side of that hill publicly, I can certainly see where the comparisons are made. The gameplay loop sees you taking on dungeons within deadlines, where you can spend your free time hanging out with allies to gain in and out of combat abilities, or you can spend your time working on one of your multiple social skills.
Also, all the things on screen currently.
Am I saying this game is just another Persona game though? No, far from it actually. Sure, while it's clear to see that it had a lot of inspiration from Persona's gameplay mechanics, Metaphor has so much more of its own identity and ideas that it deserves to stand on its own merits. So if you were to ask me if it's a Megaten game or its own thing, my answer is yes. Now this might come as a surprise to you, but I was actually one of the lucky few to receive a review copy of Metaphor directly from Atlas headquarters. Who would have thought? Well, all 8,000 subscribers, JoeFredrick is being seen by the big dogs themselves. When I got the email that I was going to be receiving a copy, there were two immediately equally powerful emotions that I felt. Excitement and overwhelming joy that Atlas was acknowledging me directly, and the mind-numbing dread and anxiety that someone at Atlas has seen all of these videos. So today, in true JoeFredrick fashion, we're going to be talking about all of the characters by analyzing them under a certain uniform question. While I of course would love to jump out the gate with a comically stupid scenario like which Metaphor characters could complete the Fortnite Battle Pass the fastest, I'd like to spend a little bit more time taking in the game before I'm ready to start my brain rot arc. So what are we going to do instead? Well, today we're going to be playing off the Persona comparisons in service of an interesting conversation piece. That means we're going to be assigning each of these characters an Arcana to represent them. In preparation for this video, I have meticulously studied how the Arcanas are not only represented in the Persona series, but their general meanings outside of the series. And also, given how recent the game has come out, I'm not going to be getting into any major spoilers. However, view at your own discretion because I will be talking about all of the things on screen here. But before we get started, make sure to leave a like and consider subscribing if you're a fan of Metaphor and want to see some more content on it. I have plenty of ideas lined up in the future, and I would love to make good on this Atlas given copy. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Welcome to the Metaphor Refantazio 2024! Now, before we get started, I want to mention at the top of this video, I will be assigning Arcana to all of the characters currently on screen. While I'll be doing my best to avoid major story spoilers, aspects of each of these characters' journeys are going to be explored, so proceed at your own caution. Now, first up, we're going to be talking about Gallica, otherwise known as Morgana if he was likable, funny, justified, helpful, or even remotely charming. Everyone's favorite fairy was actually the first character I was able to pin down and was kind of the major inspiration for me doing this video. Since I think from a very early on point in the story, you could tell that she's a shoo-in for the Magician Arcana. While I know I did just compare her to Morgana, don't immediately assume that I'm just giving that to her because of that reasoning. Since if you look at the common themes across the Magician Arcana characters, you'll actually see a lot of commonality across her and the other holders of this card. The Magician Tarot is often characterized by a few key traits, the first of which is their early appearances. A shared trait of the Magicians is that they're all very accessible from the early portions of the game. Junpei, Morgana, and Yosuke are some of the first social links you even start in those games. Even Kenji, who's one of the only non-party member magicians, fits this trope. And lo and behold, but who's the very first ally you meet on your journey? None other than Gallica. This is also supported by the fact that all of the party members I just mentioned are either seen as the protagonist's best friend or second in command. And the bond between Gallica and Will is an undeniable cornerstone of Metaphor's story. Then there's the reoccurring trait of insecurity across this card. In more general tarot definitions outside of the funny anime game, the Magician card often represents charisma and self-confidence, but reversed means, well, the reverse of the things I just said. Do I really need to spell that out for you? For example, in Persona 3, Junpei has his whole arc about wanting to be the leader of the group and resenting the protagonist because he's taken his spot. Then in Persona 4, Yosuke always wanted to be the hero of his own story, but ends up coming up short in comparison to Yu, which honestly is so not his fault. Who can blame him? He's up against Chad Naruka. And then in Persona 5, there's Morgana, who has the worst story segment in that game. Oh, he gets so pissed over being called useless once by the guy he's been running a smear campaign against for over 50 hours at this point, and he throws a fit about it. But the point I'm trying to make is that all three of those characters eventually come to terms with their self-confidence and end up finding comfort in their role in the group, which eventually leads to them being some of the greatest allies the protagonist has. And while Gallica's journey isn't as heavily focused on this characteristic, it is certainly present in the early stages of the game. Early on in the game, she's meant to be guiding the player in their journey to save the prince, but as the player ends up awakening to their power and taking a stand, this leads to her feeling like she could be doing more for the sake of the journey, and every so often feeling like she's coming up short in her responsibilities. But like the characters mentioned previously, she ends up finding her footing and gains her confidence. Now, the final trait I want to talk about is not explicitly stated on the Persona wiki, but I'm driving this inspiration from other general tarot definitions. I hated that sentence structure. And the final character trait I want to talk about is the magician's ability to forge connections with other people. They're often depicted as the salesman who sells you on yourself, or the facilitator of the tarot deck at large. This means they're often charismatic characters who are very responsible for helping the protagonist either form groups or meet new allies.
I mean, he's a commoner, so not much chance to.
Dude, what the fuck?
To give you some examples, in Persona 5, Morgana is the one to gather Ryuji and Joker and convinces them to return to the castle. It doesn't stop there though, because not only does he convince them to form the Phantom Thieves, but he also later brings in Haru in the previously mentioned worst arc of the fucking game. Then in Persona 4, while Yosuke doesn't introduce the protagonist to Yukiko and Chie, he's the one that helps bridge the gap and create this little friend group, while also having the gumption to push the investigation into the Midnight Channel, providing the group with weapons and resources, and gives them all a safe location to access the Shadow World. He even ends up housing Teddy so he can be a more prominent member of the team. The point I'm trying to make here is even though it's not as always as obvious as the magician walking up and saying, "Hey, meet my bestie," and it's no surprise that Gallica falls in line with this. Not only is she the one guiding you through the mission to save the prince, the one who gets you in contact with both Grius and tangentially Junah, she's also the one that talks Grius into letting Strohl tag along for the journey. Also, while magicians aren't exclusively tied to being magic, it's in the name and she's a fairy, so I have enough to give this to her. Continuing in tarot deck order, we've got to follow up Gallica with the priestess herself, Eupha. Can you guess which Arcana she's gonna be? Alright, as funny as it would be to wrap it up there and move on, there's more reasoning behind this correlation aside from names alone. So let's first start off by going over the traits of the priestess. For starters, the first major trait shared across all of these characters is their internal struggles between helping others and their own personal happiness. To directly quote the Mega 10 Wiki, the common problem involved with members of the Priestess Arcana is the clash between the person's own feelings involving both their personal interests and their desire to help others. It's not necessarily a conflict, but rather spurs confusion in how they wish to live and help others. If there's any character segment in this video that could be used as an argument that Team Zero wrote these characters with the Arcana in mind, Eupha as the priestess might be the strongest case. Her introduction to the game shows her offering herself up as tribute for her people in hopes to bring peace to the residents of her island. If that isn't confusion on how they wish to live and help others, I don't know what is. But that's not all, because another common trait across the priestesses is a sense of inherited expectation. What I mean by this is priestess characters often feel some sort of guilt to carry out a family tradition, or by some means uphold a status quo. In Persona 4, we see this with Yukiko and the Amagi Inn, and in Persona 5 with Makoto and pursuing a career in law. Eupha follows this trend exceptionally by being the acting priestess of the island and therefore carrying the responsibility of acting as a sacrifice. And then finally, one of the most prominent traits about these characters is the act of finding nuances in seemingly simple problems. problems. This one is kind of hard to explain, so just stick with me on this one. Like earlier, I'm going to use Yukiko as an example to make this point. So in the events of the early game and throughout her social link in Persona 4, we learned that Yukiko is one day set to inherit the Amagi Inn from her family, which is kind of her main conflict she faces throughout the game. At the start of the journey, she feels incredibly boxed in by this eventual future, and she believes it will keep her locked in this small town, and she'll never get to truly be free. If you couldn't tell by the subtle, absolute, hidden metaphor of the bird in a cage. But as the months go by, and through interactions with the protagonist, she finds value in her status in her family as a member of the inn and in the city in general. And this ends up helping her realize that just because she's going to inherit the inn one day, that doesn't mean she's never going to be able to feel free or have her own happiness and identity. The point I'm trying to articulate here is that priestesses are often quick to scare themselves into this incredibly finite and reserved way of thinking about their lives and futures. But through the actions of the player and their friends, they learn to apply layers to those challenges and discover more about themselves and the world around them. This can also be seen by Makoto's views on popularity and her place in her family, and Fuka's value in herself and the group of season whole. To once again quote the Megaten Wiki, while the priestess is about pursuing and listening to one's inner knowledge, to prevent instances of being misguided, it is important to skillfully break down information to the barest extent and mix multiple simultaneously, achieving profound and well thought out results. But most importantly, it is important to confront that to untangle any misconceptions, as one's fears might not be able to be confronted physically, whether through initiative or hiding. This level of internalization and self-reflecting can lead to these characters being reserved and quieter than their peers, and they can only truly find their voices in this world by helping their friends find their own. Next up is our first non-party member, Rella. Without saying too much, I'd highly recommend you skip to the timestamp on screen if you want to fully avoid spoilers. Go ahead and skip right now. Let me give you a few seconds here to clear out. Alright, that's probably enough time. Rella fucking curses the Alright, let me explain. So the Empress has a few notable traits worth discussing. First off, are their affinity for ice moves. You might be like me and see that and think, what do you mean? Literally only Mitsuru uses ice skills of the known Empresses. Well, this fact is more in reference to personas of the Empress, such as Scotty. The affinity for Bufu skills is often paired with supporting abilities, either through buffs, debuffs, or reflective barriers. Now, how exactly does Rella's fight go? Well, she fucking conjures a goddamn ice dragon like a motherfucking Pokemon master, but supports it in combat by debuffing your party, buffing the dragon, and yes, raising reflective walls. Wait a minute, is that starting to sound familiar to you guys? But this isn't where the similarities end, actually, because if we look at Rella's specific skill set, it lines up pretty nicely with the Empress's other traits. Rella's significance in the story can be broken down to her duality between being the country's most powerful healer and its most infamous cursor. While some of the previous Empresses are known for their healing and status moves, like Mitsuru, where the real comparison starts to flood in are the move pools of the actual personas. 9 out of the 20 Empress personas have some form of healing ability, and out of 20 learn a status move. There are even some arguments to be made about comparing her mass manipulation spells to Marin Karin, or her long-range telepathy to Mitsuru's early navigator abilities. But we'll wrap it up there for now. Then in a similar vein to the Priestess, the Empresses often come from a notable family or hold a position of authority. For Haru and Mitsuru, they are the heiresses to their family names. And Margaret is one of the acting Velvet Room attendants across numerous games. Rella fits the bill perfectly by not only being the acting saint over Town in Fantasyland, but also for a period of time ends up running for the throne as the new leader of the Sanctifex Church. These ties to notoriety segue into our next beat to hit, which is the theme of breaking out of those expectations to discover one's own true desires. The characters of this card will often find themselves being somewhat shackled by what expectations their statuses of authority put on them, and will often overcome these hurdles by allowing themselves to open up their own personal desires, aspirations, and softer emotions to the people around them. We see this play out through the events of the final act of Metaphor, where Rella reveals to the party from her teenage years the church had been using her family name against her and guilted her into casting the curse on the prince. And it's only through her relationship with Junah that allows herself to feel those emotions and set herself free of her own curse by freeing the prince of his. And finally, this one is going to sound weird, but the wiki is somehow very insistent on letting you know that Empress characters are often conventionally attractive. Like, personally, I feel like this is super subjective, but with how often it's mentioned mentioned, I feel like if I didn't say it, then someone in the comments would. Luckily for us, all of the Empresses are canonically over 18 and Haru doesn't fucking exist, so it's okay. All right, finally we can talk about one of the guys. Only took us 1 pixie and 2 suicidal sisters to get here, but we did it. So Basilio, our stupid golden retriever boy here, while not was instantly easy to pin down like the first few have been, I actually decided he would fit best as the Emperor. Now this might not make immediate sense upon first proposal, and I can't say that I blame you. There are as many similarities between Basilio and Odagiri as there are subscribers on my channel. Okay, not a great comparison, but we could always make that number higher if you just smash that subscribe button. But once you start looking into some of the broader strokes of this card, you'll start to see the connections. While the Emperor does start off with traits like obsessive and eccentric, which might not fit Sibilio, once you get past the hurdle, it's kind of a slam dunk. Characters of the Emperor card often have the habit of some sort of craft or art, which, while everyone in the game is seen cooking, Basilio is the only one who the game really goes out of their way to say has a significant talent for it, and is often used as a reward at some of the end of his social links. Then Emperors often find themselves struggling with finding their own identity after the loss of a mentor figure. To quote the Mega 10 wiki directly, generally having lost touch with the guidance of someone they trust, the characters try to find a sweet spot to establish their independence in between having their lives be completely controlled and becoming bad people that they would be ashamed of. At first, they're purists in their beliefs, refusing to view things from different perspectives, but over time, they understand their mistakes and lead their own lives while trusting the guidance from others. This trait works exceptionally well for Basilio, as this reflects not only the mentors he found in Fidelio and Vinca, but also reflects his journey of serving Luis, clinging onto his ideals he preached, but through the companionship he formed with the party, learned to form his own beliefs and not be too stubborn. His social link even begins with him saying how he always followed someone stronger than him, and now he wants to forge his own path. So I think there's enough here to give it to him. Next up is the Hierophant, and while there isn't as crystal clear of a character that fits this card, I believe that Batlin the town crier of all people would actually be our closest bet. Let's not waste any time and jump straight into the traits. First of which is being an older character who holds admiration for the protagonist. According to the Mega 10 wiki, characters of the Hierophant Arcana are often older than the protagonist, and are typically quite wise and logical. Usually male and gruff, they care for the protagonist like a parent to a child. While Batlin doesn't necessarily view the protagonist like a surrogate kid or anything, he certainly is one of the older characters in the roster, and makes it known he cares for the young lad a decent deal, expressing this sentiment through his continued support for him throughout his race for the throne. Another trait of the Hierophant is how the loss of a loved one kept them struggling to move on from the past. We see this with all 3 bearers of the card, with Bunkichi and Mitsuko struggling to come to terms with their son dying in a car crash, Dojima struggling to move on from the loss of his wife, and Sojiro trying to struggle to accept Wakaba's death. But when the protagonist comes into their lives, they are able to help the Hierophant come to terms with their losses and accept that the person who they cared about wouldn't want them to dwell on their death for the rest of their lives. Batlin went through a similar struggle when his father passed away. When he was younger, he watched his father work as a crier for the Sanctifex Church, which, by the way, in general tarot readings, the Hierophant is often seen as the male counterpart to the Priestess and sometimes is tied to religion, and while this isn't a consistent trend in the Persona adaptations, it felt worth mentioning with Batlin since he was working for the church, and eventually called out the church's unlawful igniter experiments on Parapet citizens. No surprise, the church was pretty fucking peeved by that and sent him to downtown Tombsville. Batlin saw this and didn't want to suffer the same fate, so he buckled under the fear and pressure and became a subservient crier for the church. However, through witnessing the protagonist and his early aspects of his journey, he was instilled with a newfound hope in the future of the country. I know it might seem like these points are being stretched a bit for a character we honestly don't see all that often, but I fully believe that if Batlin had received a full social link like data miners suspected him to, these plot points would have been fleshed out a hell of a lot more than we got to see of him. But for now, I think it's still enough to give him the card. Next up, we've got the Lover's Arcana. And if you thought Eupha and the Priestess were some of the most obvious allocations, let me introduce to you Junah. Now, the general meaning of the Lover's Arcana isn't always as simple as having to do with relationships as some people might think. While there's certainly an aspect of that in the card, it can also be representing a pair of conflicting ideals or situations a person might be facing. In the Persona series, however, there are a few common threads characters in this Arcana share. First of which, they're all women. Not really a lot to talk about at this point, but a slightly more in-depth talking piece, however, would be a consistent theme of choice. Characters of the Lover's Arcana are often posed with a difficult choice to make, one option typically being for their own selfish benefit, while the other tends to be the one that would do more good for others. Some examples being Risei choosing between being a model or living a more modest lifestyle, Yukari welcoming her mom back into the family, or beefing with the other model. Honestly, fuck On. I'm never not gonna fuck that character. While Junah's social link isn't entirely devoted to this type of storyline, a turning point in her social link is when a rival songstress is poisoned and she has to go retrieve flowers to make the antidote. But doing so would spark a very traumatic experience for her, which will cause her to, and then play a clip of like, show me your true form. Oh, fuck, ow. Now that I've picked myself off of the ground, next up is a super simple one, which is characters having some sort of experience with the entertainment industry. On being a model, Yukari being an actress, and both Risei and Lisa being idols.
Did you just talk about Persona 2?
Let's quietly move on. If we acknowledge it, they might start expecting it of me, and we really can't have that. Requiring very little explanation, it's obvious that Junah fits the bill here, as she's the country's most renowned songstress. Lovers characters tend to be incredibly popular at school, and often have a friendly, bubbly demeanor. I'd say all of the Lovers characters, except for maybe Yukari, fit this bill nicely, and Eupha is no different. Honestly, this one just kind of comes down to the vibes category. And finally, one major story beat Lovers characters typically follow is an uncertainty of their future. Characters of this card typically don't really know what they want to do after the events of the game. Sure, they might be popular now, but after their goals in this game are complete and they graduate, what do they really want from their lives? While this is a trait that I think is notable enough to mention here, this is probably the weakest element in case of Junah. The most her storyline gives us of this particular headline is being reminded of why she loves to be a performer, by helping out the new songstress in her social link. But as far as her certainty of her future goes, it feels like we get her after she figured all that stuff out on her own. Also, she doesn't hug the protagonist at any point that I know of.
Shut it down! The video's ruined!
From one girl boss to the next, it's the freak-eating knight herself, Hulkenberg, and she's going to be our Chariot for the video. The Chariot is honestly one of the more simple arcanas to break down, so in honor of its name, we're gonna saddle in and blitz right through this one. To quote the Mega 10 Wiki, Chariot holders are typically very driven and athletic individuals who have a personal goal they aim to achieve at any cost. Often brash but good-hearted, they struggle with weakness or doubts that they have to try to hide from everyone else, but they eventually slowly up to the protagonist about. This to me perfectly reflects Hulkenberg to a T. At first she comes off proper and driven, we learn she's actually deeply insecure about her failures and lives every aspect of her life in pursuit of atoning for those mistakes. Now the meaning of the card tends to go on talking about how characters of the Chariot Arcana tend to be a bit too stubborn in their goals and need to learn to take a breather. Like Kazuishi running on a broken leg out of a stubborn desire to complete his goal in Persona 3. However, even though we don't really get a physical example of her pushing herself too far, it's how she pushes herself emotionally that becomes evident. There are multiple instances across the game where Hulkenberg breaks down out of shame for her failures and needs to be reminded to take a breather and assess her situation more fairly to herself for her to compose herself and live up to her full potential. Now, honestly, that's pretty much where the narrative similarities end. The rest are just a bunch of fun facts tying her to this card. Like, just to run down the list here, not only do Chariot characters tend to be party members more often than not, they're some of the earliest ones to join your party when they are filling that role. All these party members tend to focus on physical skills with some occasional magic capabilities, which can be seen through the Knight tree of her archetype. Then starting in Persona 4 onward, the Chariot Arcana tends to give a unique combat-related ability seen by Chie's Galactic Punt and Ryuji's Insta-Kill. Well, Hulkenberg is the only character in the game that gets access to the ability to protect the player from a lethal attack. Another trend from P4 onward are the Chariots having an increased appetite or aptitude for eating, which I don't need to explain how Hulkenberg meets. Hell, even her archetype is a dude using an animal as a mode of transport, like the Chariot card depicts. Honestly, with Hulkenberg, while the details are a bit smaller, there's just enough of them scattered through her design and narrative that makes it feel inappropriate to give her anything else. Next up, we're going to talk about the Justice Arcana, which, if you know me even in the slightest,
There's a high bar to cross with the competition here.
look at this silly boy! So this was actually pretty tough for me at first to decide between Strohl and Fidelio for this one. But after some deliberation, I decided to give it to Fidelio. The first common trait to discuss with the Justice Arcana are their dead parents. That's a really hard line to read in the YouTuber voice. Excuse me, Fidelio, the dead parent police just called, and yeah, you're gonna want to get down to the station,
Cause you got some dead parents down there.
we got ourselves a real gauntlet here. Dead mom, no dad, dead mom, drunk dad, and dead mom, bald dad. The worst kind of dad one could have. The second kind of worst dad. And Fidelio is no different. While we don't know anything about his parents, we do know that him and Basilio were orphans from a very young age. Next up are these characters' desires for fairness or the idea of karma. This is reflected in various storylines for characters of this card, such as... okay. I think it should just be made clear here if it hasn't been already. If you don't want spoilers for any of the main 3 modern Persona games, just click the timestamp on screen and that'll skip you to the next segment. Yeah, so Ken and Akechi are pretty similar in motivation. They both seek out revenge against characters affiliated with their mother's deaths. And then the storytelling tools used to convey that point screech to a fucking stop with the other two, who are like, oh, it's not fair. People blamed me for stealing money from the school when I was crying about needing money. Or, oh, boo-hoo, my negligent drunk father who never comes home. Anyways, Fidelio. Yeah, kind of his whole character is oriented around the idea of fairness. He's a devout follower and right hand to Luis due to the campaign promises of establishing equality and mutual rights across the tribes. An idealistic future that Fidelio clings to due to how much discrimination him and his brother and his people in general were forced to endure. Then there's a consistent trait of these characters often being reserved, stoic, or walls put up as a consequence of their upbringing. Whether they're woo shy or I'm just a friendly face and I'm gonna fucking kill you. These characters tend to have trouble opening up to others. But of course, all of them have the Chad swag protagonist find a way to waltz into their hearts and win them over. This strategy has a mortality rate of over 75%. 60%! It's through their actions that the justice holders begin to realize that their ideals, while not unfounded, were misguided, and they begin to formulate their own sense of justice and equality in a much more realized sense than they had before. Fidelio follows this plot perfectly by starting off as an adamant, stubborn follower in his beliefs to the degree where he's blinded by how actually antithetical Luis's campaign promises are to his ideals. But through the kindness of the people of Etria and the party, he establishes a newfound perception of who should be king, even offering up his life to save the player, leaving the party with the task of killing the source of his misguided ideals in his memory. See, guys, it always comes back to my boy somehow. And then finally, characters of the Justice Arcana are often depicted as childish in some regard. This is most obviously evident with characters like Ken and Nanako, and while Chihiro and Akechi don't seem to fit this bill externally, they both are prone to their childish tantrums or breakdowns. This was kind of honestly the deciding factor between Strohl and Fidelio getting this role, because just look at Fidelio. Next up is the Hermit, and as obvious as Lovers, Magician, and Priestess were to me upon starting this video, I knew from the get-go that Neuras was gonna be a shoo-in here. The Hermit is honestly one of the simpler cards to break down, having a few common traits that require very little explanation. First of which is an affinity for reclusing themselves, either from anxiety or hyperfixating on hobbies that might not be considered mainstream or very social. Both Maya and Futaba are incredibly tech-savvy and hide themselves for a period of time behind digital avatars. While the world was spared of VTuber girl Neuras, his entire backstory is centered around sheltering himself away from his royal heritage and multiple opportunities in life due to hyperfixating on his passion for engineering. You might say he's a bit neurodivergent. Wait. Then characters of this Arcana are often part of the party but are helping from behind the scenes. To give some examples, the Fox from Persona 4 helps the party out by healing them, while Futaba acts as a navigator and hacker to help support the Phantom Thieves' reputation. And on this line of thinking, Neuras might be one of the most goated support characters in SMT history. Sure, he's never summoning archetypes and slugging them down sicko style, but he'll fucking nuke stowaways on his own damn ship. Oh, that ship, by the way, I can't even begin to list out how many times this runner saves the party. Without it, the kingdom would be rubble at this point. And then finally, characters of this Arcana Arcana just tend to be a bit antisocial and a bit introverted. You can make your own conclusions on why they might behave this way, but to put it simply, I'll quote the Megaten Wiki and say, explaining the purpose of escapism of how reality is shaped by one's thoughts and expectations, but also warrants of self-reflection through personal observation of one's actions, describing the person who's currently interacting as the reflection in another mirror, specifically of oneself. TLDR, they're just kind of quirky. Similarly to our previous entry, the Fortune Arcana, at least in the context of the Persona series, is actually wildly simple and can be summed up into two major points. Characters who end up in unfair situations due to circumstances out of their control, and then an overwhelming sense of peer pressure to be something they aren't. And when you lay out the points like that, it only makes sense to me to give this card to Bardon. He fits the first requirement nicely, as he was unwittingly serving a queen who had been harboring a human and feeding her citizens to it out of the misguided grief of her lost child. Despite Bardon having literally nothing to do with that, he holds himself accountable and blames himself for not noticing sooner. Then, once you unlock his follower bond, you follow the storyline of the townspeople nominating him to run the town in absence of, you know, that freak queen, a role that he never felt he was appropriate for. But he's eventually convinced into doing it, makes some misguided decisions with good intent, and eventually gets reprimanded by the townspeople for it. It's only when he acts on his true intuition and behaves more like himself than the people the town wanted him to be is when he saves the day. Honestly, I'm really sorry if this segment seems way shorter than the others. I'm really not trying to skimp out on this one. I like Bardon and the other Fortune characters a decent amount, but there just weren't as many interesting connecting threads here other than the two I just mentioned. So if you think there's something else I could have expounded on in this segment, let me know down in the comments. Now that's going to cover the first 10 cards of the deck, which I'd like to use this opportunity to take a quick detour and cover 2 cards at the same time, as they reside at opposite ends of the deck, but are often paired together in the context of a Persona game. Those being the Fool and Judgment cards. What, you thought I was gonna use this intermission to mention stuff like, I don't know, subscribing to the channel, hitting that bell, or supporting us on Patreon, where you can get all sorts of perks like the ones listed on screen, in addition to free copies of my published tabletops, both physically and digitally? Of course not! So the Fool Arcana, while often associated with the protagonists, is actually more commonly associated with narrative benchmarks throughout the game. In Persona 3 and 4, the card is tied to the group's respective teams, which upon completion are very quickly followed up by a new objective for the group to tackle.
Super Luigi Galaxy!
You'll really do anything other than finish that Mario Galaxy video, won't you?
And whose fault is that, Joe?
In Persona 5, this is handled a bit differently by having 2 corresponding automated social links happening at the same time, but you get the idea. They're often tied to the main objective of the game. Well, I think the simplest way to handle these in Metaphor's case is play it pretty close to how Persona 3 and 4 handled it. Early on in the game, you'd unlock it as like the Prince recovery effort, and then after a certain event near the final act of the game that we're not gonna talk about today, this Arcana would wrap up and a second one would be unlocked, called something like the Prince's Army, or the Presidential Assassination Effort. Wait, can we make that joke yet? Next up on the docket is the Strength card, and while it took some deliberating, I decided that the fledgling Prince Strohl would fit the bill best. The Strength card is honestly kind of weird to explain. The major characters representing this Arcana are a dog, a couple of ball fondlers, and a velvet room attendant. So it takes just a tad bit more work to find the commonalities across these characters, but I think I did a semi-decent job. However, instead of going bit by bit, I'm going to read you a few descriptions and give you my thoughts in one grand swoop this time around. Starting off, to take a quote from the website howstuffworks.com, that is the real fucking name of that website. The Strength card encourages you to be mindful of your raw emotions and instinctual urges, harmonizing them with greater good and acting with kindness and understanding. This graceful approach, known as soft power, allows you to achieve your objectives without resorting to animosity or conflict. And then to jump back to the Megaten wiki for the following, characters of the Strength Arcana are typically individuals of noteworthy fortitude, often involved in athletics in some way. However, the strength they show is largely a facade born of deep-seated insecurity or feel of failure. I'm choosing to interpret a couple of things from these definitions. The first of which is the struggle between tackling an issue from an emotional or critical standpoint. When faced with problems, it's easy to either completely give in to your emotions and act irrationally, or to handle a situation too critically and closing yourself off from perspectives only your emotions could give. In short, yeah, the left brain right my brain sog for boredom. I believe the Strength card is about harnessing both someone's ethos and pathos to achieve a grander level of conflict resolution and understanding of the world around them.
That's a lot of words.
This can be seen in a very exaggerated form through Caroline and Justine, where one is extremely emotional and the other is overcritical. And it's only through harnessing both aspects of themselves that they were able to come back together to form Lavenza. I believe this trend can be continued further in Persona 4, where the player is given the choice between Daisuke and Ko, where the former is more level-headed and analytical, and the latter is more emotionally driven. This is further reflected in how they handle their relationships in the game, as Daisuke prioritizes his goals and deems putting efforts into superfluous things like his girlfriend as fruitless. Meanwhile, Ko is much more emotionally driven and is actively pursuing relationships through the course of his story. I think Strohl fits this bill pretty cleanly. Sure, his main arc throughout the game is seeking revenge against Luis and proving himself as a noble. It's his social link where he discovers he has an inheritance from his parents and is faced with how to use it. Sure, he could make the logically sound investment into rebuilding his family house, or the empathetic choice and pay for housing for the survivors of his village. You could probably dig up more examples of this battle between rational and emotional, like when he stands up to Luis at the party, despite it being antithetical to the task at hand, but I think what matters most here is this scene in the final act of the game. When the party is pursuing Luis, they are inevitably swarmed by a herd of humans, and Strohl is the one to suggest that the player go on ahead, while they hold off the rest of the enemies. This is an objectively intelligent decision that will give them the best chance of victory, while also clearly being driven by his own care for the player. And at the end of this scene, as Strohl passes out due to combat, we hear him mutter the words,
Finally, I've earned my title.
This moment is meant to signify the end of the Strength card's journey, as he has truly harnessed both the emotional and rational sides of himself and achieved that greater level of internal strength referred to as soft power. Next up is the Hanged Man Arcana, and alright, I'm going to be completely honest and break script here. I don't really think there's a good character for the Hanged Man at this point, and you'll soon come to see all the characters I think could have fit the Hanged Man Arcana, I actually ended up giving to different cards. But for consistency's sake, let's go over it. The Hanged Man card and characters of its ilk typically symbolize the act of achieving enlightenment through self-sacrifice. And while there certainly are characters who fit this description, they're better off in other categories. Instead, even though it's a massive stretch, I guess we'll give this one to Grius. He may not have achieved enlightenment through his sacrifice, but his actions certainly instilled a set of stakes for the party. Yeah, I'm really sorry guys. I know this is a really lame cop-out section, but I just genuinely was stumped on this one. Let me know in the comments who you think would be a better fit. I might just bin my favorite. Alright, Heismay gaming time. Leave it to Atlas to circumvent expectations by making the marketable plush character into the grizzled old man badass archetype. Now, if you're familiar with the tarot deck order at this point, you'll have realized by now that Grandpa over here is going to be our death card. Now, the 13th card in the tarot deck is often oversimplified to this guy's old, or this card deals with morality definitions, which are true in some cases. The card is much more nuanced than that. Characters of this arcana often hold themselves accountable for the health or loss of a loved one, even when they weren't solely or even remotely responsible for it. In Persona 4, this can be seen with Hisano and her husband, in Persona 5 with Takemi and her patients, and in Persona 3, well, that one's kind of not fair because bro is literally death incarnate, but Heismay reflects this trend unfortunately all too well, as his backstory and social link is entirely rooted in the loss of his son, and how he holds himself accountable for his death despite doing everything he could given his circumstances. On that note, the next notable story beat these characters tend to hit is learning to forgive themselves and embrace their futures. Through the help and guidance of the protagonist, characters of this card are able to break through their self-deprecating chains and allow themselves to move on and carry what they've learned through their experience to help others to move forward. Heismay mirrors this perfectly, as it's only through coming to terms with his son's death and settled on a proper burial for him that he chooses to return to his home village and inspires them to come out of hiding and welcome in the outside world once again, an exact parallel to the choices he had to learn to make during his act of the game. And then finally, a proper way to capstone this entry, most personas of the Death Arcana are proficient in curse skills, which Heismay's archetype, the Thief, is skilled in casting and resistant to. Yeah, not all of these entries are going to be as in-depth as the strength ones. Some of these are just kind of simple. Next up, we've got the 14th card, Temperance. And similar to the Fortune Arcana, this is one of the simpler cards in regards to how the Persona series personifies it. The Temperance Arcana often is oriented around the characters balancing a personal passion or hobby, while dealing with and concealing the mass amounts of stress they're currently undergoing. This stress typically comes from either people related to their job or through the loss of a loved one. And when you lay out the details like that, I decided to give it to Fabienne, otherwise known as Hava. Seriously, where was her follower bond? Alright, simping aside, Fabienne is a character who is pretty consistent throughout the early acts of the game, but through the lack of having a proper social link, there isn't too much to talk about. We know she puts a lot of work and passion into running the Honeybee Inn despite some of the more problematic citizens. And she also has to keep up a strong demeanor for the sake of Maria after the loss of Grius. Also in line with the Temperance Arcana, they're all hot women. All of them. Once again, like with the fortune section, sorry if this segment is a bit shorter comparatively to some of the others. It's just kind of an unfortunate fact that some of the Arcana get way more love and attention than others. But if there's anything else you think I should have mentioned, let me know down in the comments. After a few quick entries, we have one of our more intricate and respected cards, but I'm not actually going to be the one taking this. The next entry will be this video's Patreon cameo segment. If you didn't know, members of my Patreon get a chance of cameoing in any of my uploads. And today's lucky winner is my good friend Will. How fitting is that, huh? Another fun fact about him is he was the voice actor for Joker in the Persona Q2 dub up on this channel. Which, by the way, guys, it's not coming back. Please stop asking. This segment is going to be a little bit longer than normal, but it's a very nuanced card for a very layered character. So with introductions out of the way, let's give a warm welcome to Arrow Shifter.
Sorry, gang.
You're stuck with me now.
I have the privilege of discussing everyone's favorite funny faker, Alonzo Crotalis. The devil is in the details, so let's dive in and discuss the Devil Arcana. Alonzo himself would be the first to admit that he's not exactly a paragon of virtue, though not without some additional prodding or perhaps a delicate sprinkling of blackmail. Putting the con into confidence, man takes pride in his ability, nay, his obligation, to swindle the swindlers of the world. This began as a means to protect his mother, the parapet woman that adopted him off the streets. She was as kind-hearted as they come, but this often made her a target of trickery. So the debauchery of the Nidian ne'er-do-well comes from a sense of justice, rather than being something he wants for himself. In a way, he's become trapped within his own vice. Which brings us to the devil's depiction. The Devil Arcana itself has myriad meanings, but most relate to a limitation of personal growth. Much like the figures the devil has chained in a typical portrayal, those represented by this Arcana are often chained to their own depravity or impurity, whether that be an unhealthy addiction, an insatiable greed, or an abuse of power and control. But in these same depictions, the chains around the figures are always loose. They can escape from the corruption binding them, these often self-imposed limitations, though the way out may not always seem clear. Let's look back at Alonzo. First, the chains that bind him. I'll start with the big one, the addiction to his very shame. Even after his constant deception led to the dispute with the landowner and further to the death of his mother, his solution is to continue the farce to bring about change, finding atonement through his impenitence. His own village called for his death, blaming him for everything that befell them, so he deigns to bear their sins on his own shoulders. And this balance is another aspect of the devil. Despite maintaining his cool facade, he's broken on the inside. Rather than indifference or hatred, he intends to shoulder this burden and try to rectify his own fall by granting his village the prosperity he'd always wanted to grant it. And though his initial plan for it went up in flames, there's still a light to be found amongst the cinders. There's very little Alonzo does that doesn't have some sort of catch. Even most of his friendships, if you can even call them that, are hinged on favors owed and debts repaid. His relationship with Will begins in a similar way. When Grius' dagger is stolen from you, he introduces himself under his pseudonym in a suspiciously convenient fashion before offering to help, if you help him first. While he does hold up his end of the bargain and eventually reveals his true identity to you when he deems you a valuable asset, it still goes to show that everything and everyone is a commodity to the man, which is exactly how he wants to be perceived. His noble intentions buried beneath a veneer of sin and swagger, that is, until it's spurred on by a big change. His mother's death was a turning point for Alonzo. She was his reason to keep going. Despite the name, real or otherwise, he'd made for himself, everything he'd done was for her sake. So what remains now that she's gone? A shattered charade? A crying child? More than that. Alonzo is prepared for the death that awaits him, the punishment wished upon him by the very people he grew up around, who he wanted to save. He intends to take his own life. That is, before Will steps in.
Give me a break!
You, perhaps Alonzo's only real friend, remind him that this is not the fate that his mother would want for him, and he hesitates. Redemption, breaking the cycle, moving on. The devil reversed, reclaiming power from what once held you hostage. Alonzo has this revelation and resolves to make everything right. As I said before, Alonzo turns what he'd long since become into something new. He becomes a martyr of sorts, using all he'd accrued, skills and capital both, to not only benefit his people, but to help the friend that helped him at his darkest moment. He found the willpower to free himself from his chains. Alonzo Crotalis is many things. A liar, a cheat, a fraud. He's a devil. But despite what he may believe, he's no villain.
Alright, yeah, sorry guys, it's me now. I don't have a silky smooth voice like that last guy, but I'm gonna try to follow. Since my return to this video is the equivalent of a natural disaster in its own right, let's discuss the Tower Arcana. While I originally was considering Grius for this role, after some further deliberation, I decided that a way better pick would be good old Grifferoth himself, Luis. Now, I'm not going to get into any major spoilers for Luis in this section, but I will be talking about some light details about his story, so to be super safe, so the Tower card has a few things to go over. Starting with some of the simpler ones, characters of this card often require the protagonist to prove themselves in some way to earn their trust. So for example, in Persona 5, Shinya, requires you to get, like, a dub in Fortnite or something. Honestly, it's been a few years since I've done that social, but in Metaphor, a major arc of the game is fulfilling multiple tasks for Luis to earn his trust. This is to give you and your party a better chance at taking him down from inside his ranks. Then characters of this card are often associated with being overly arrogant, prejudiced, and authoritarian organizations, which eventually lead to their own ironic demise. Once again, I'll be light in my explanation here since I don't want to give too many spoilers, but Luis's introduction to the game is him literally showing up in front of the entire kingdom and being like, yeah, I killed the king, and I'm gonna trample over anyone who's weaker than me. So yeah, that one tracks. It's also worth noting that these characters typically end up in this way due to isolation and mistreatment by external forces outside of their control, which we learn in the final act of the game does line up with Luis quite nicely. And the final point we're going to touch on this video is the general overall meaning of this card and how it symbolizes ruin and disaster. The Tower card is often depicted as the worst one you can get in a reading, as it often symbolizes impending doom or a calamitous future. The card is also unique as it's one of the few that represents how the player responds to the meaning of the card more so than it to them. To quote the Mega 10 Wiki, accepting the inevitability of doom isn't through yielding completely and accepting the good thing it presents, but rather realizing that the things it threatens are irreplaceable, and the pressure of their inevitable doom is what makes them worth protecting. This is why personas of this arcana are often represented by mythological heroes who have fallen from grace, such as Magatsu Izanagi. And when you consider that the point of that persona is to represent how similar the antagonist and protagonist are to each other, just one chose a more destructive path, and then compare that to the backgrounds of the protagonist and Luis, it's a pretty clean fit. Luis himself is the narrative embodiment of what the Tower represents. He is the impending calamity. He is the natural disaster that can't be avoided but only confronted. He was seen as a hero of his people who fell from grace. Honestly, this segment doesn't do him much justice, and I guarantee you within a few months of this game being out there will be countless character study pieces on him. But for now, without wanting to spoil his story much further, we're going to leave it off at that. Next up is the Star Arcana, and the award for the character who I was most excited to get in my party, only to find out she wasn't really a party member, goes to... While this card doesn't have the most common threads to work off of, like gameplay styles or small details across all the characters, what ultimately made me decide to give this to Catherina is the general message of the star. To quote the Mega 10 Wiki, God, take a shot every time I say that in this video. While somewhat antisocial, they embody their arcana's traits of hopefulness and joy, while also dealing with acute struggles both internally and externally. Their links with the protagonists help them to recognize and accept misconceptions about their lives' paths and comprehend what they truly want. To simplify things, characters of the Star Arcana often start off with an idea of what their futures hold for them, but for one reason or another, they either realize that their means of achieving it are misguided, or they want something entirely different from what they originally thought, and they must take responsibility for their previous actions that led up to this point. This is exactly the narrative we follow with Catherina, as when we first meet her, she's a bit antisocial towards the party, but over the course of the game, as she appears more and more, we learn she's actually running in the race for the throne, where she promises to put boundaries bounties on all the nobles' heads for their mistreatments of the Parapus people. Though as things escalate out of control, she realizes that this isn't going to make life any easier for her people, but more so will it continue the cycle of violence that deprived her people in the first place. In the final ranks of her story, she ends up gathering her supporters to revoke her previous ambitions and opts to help her people in a different way by providing them jobs, walking away from this experience much more fulfilled in her decisions in future. A perfect example of the journey of the star. Up next, we've got the Star Arcana, otherwise known as the card with the really weirdly content-looking face on it. Ultimately, I decided that Maria would be the best fit. Adam, I know it's the Year of Shadow, but I really need you to keep it together here. Characters of the Sun Arcana often find themselves in horribly lonely situations and are easy to become hopeless when it comes to accomplishing their goals. We see this occur for her as after the loss of her father, she feels like she's completely alone in the world. Sure, she's got Fabienne, but it takes her a while to really open up to her and feel like a proper daughter and less of a burden. Next is the struggle of wanting to accomplish something, realizing that their straightforward approach isn't going to find them the success they were hoping for, and the only way to achieve it is through different, sometimes unconventional means. One of the ongoing plot threads in Maria's follower bond is her wanting to befriend both a young Parapus boy and a local bully. She tries standard approaches with each of the two, but ends up getting dismayed after neither of them going particularly well. It isn't until the protagonist cheers her up and gives her the confidence she needs to try winning them over through the combined efforts of showing them paintings from across the world and holding free food events that she gets the outcome she's hoping for. And then finally, an admittedly novel point, personas of the Sun Arcana are often proficient in the light affinity, which the healer archetype has in spades. Honestly, another one of the more simple cards, but it just made sense. As the sun starts to set on this video, it's time we talk about one of the more layered cards, the Moon. And like with the Hanged Man, I actually had some trouble with this one. Don't get me wrong, there were plenty of characters that could work, but I had already allocated them to other cards. So before we get into the holder, let's break down what this card really means. To quote the Mega 10 Wiki, the Moon Arcana is associated with creativity, inspiration, dreams, madness, illusion, fear, fantasy, the subconscious, and trickery. Characters who are of the Moon Arcana are often similarly psychically attuned, but a more common trend is their projection of their own fears and faults onto others, namely the protagonist. They often have trouble accepting themselves for who they are, and because of what they fear, try to correspond to an ideal person. And like the Arcana, there is a hidden depth as to why they act in their behaviors. So even if it is a bit of a stretch, I think our best fit here would be Brigitta. While I personally feel like she fits better as a secondary Temperance rep, she checks a few of the boxes here. We see her take out a lot of her pent-up frustrations on not only the protagonist, but to a lesser extent, the dog she finds companionship in. We also learn it's due to her upbringing as a poor starving orphan that made her conform to being this stone-cold businesswoman she is today. But that's not who she truly is deep down. And finally, the terms creativity, dreams, fear, illusions, and trickery are all descriptors of her journey being a destitute child all the way to the unknowing pawn of the Sanctifest Church. So even if it isn't as much of a slam dunk as some of our other cards, I personally feel like it's not a terrible choice either. And it should come as no surprise at this point that our final Arcana of the video is going to be the World, and it's going to be given to the Prince himself, Will. The World Arcana is often given as a reward or last-minute power boost to the protagonist to use to push through the final boss of the game. In Metaphor, we essentially get two different applicable scenes that fit this event. You could either choose when Will and the Prince unite as one, or in the final boss of the game when the Prince archetype evolves into that of the King and cuts Luis down once and for all. Between these two, I personally feel like the latter is more in line with the Persona series, with examples like Santanaya and Izanagi no Okami. The World Arcana is often personified as giving the player the power to change the world. And with a story as magical and fantastical as Metaphor, and its narrative focuses on fantasy and fiction, I couldn't think of a better Arcana to represent the Prince's journey and its destination. And with that, folks, we've covered every major Arcana. Sure, there were a handful of allocations I personally wasn't entirely convinced of. I think you could agree with me that there's enough here to reasonably conclude that the writers of Metaphor were still trying to write these characters with some of the cards' meanings in mind. That's not even to mention that there are Arcana fragments tied to specific classes when crafting masks. By the way, I'm sure there are a bunch of you who have already commented about those, and if you haven't already, not all of the classes classes lined up identically with the cards I gave their corresponding characters, but a good handful of them did. I'll leave in either the description or a pinned comment below which ones ended up lining up. But that's gonna wrap up the video for today. Metaphor Refantazio is a fucking phenomenal video game, and I'm excited to make some more of my traditional brain rot content on it. Let me know what kind of silly scenarios you'd like me to throw these characters into. But before that, let me know what you thought of this more grounded video. Did you hate it? Did you love it? Would you prefer I stick to my more stupid analysis stuff, or would you like some more of this genuine character study work in between? Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know down in the comments what you would have done differently when it came to the allocations, and I'll see you all next time. Hey everyone, it's post-production Joe here. I'm here for the credits. I want to give a special thanks to my Patreon followers: Little Miss Hopeful, Arrow Shifter, Gunmetal Gator, The Retro System, John Cole aka The Chicken Cowboy, Sakura Schwein, Faytail, Angel, Daniela Volkova, Joseph Sadecki, Amy Pubs, and Ben Hutler. Also want to give a special thanks to all of the editors involved with this project. Of course, Adam, as well as returning editors, Smash Max and Kian, and then some new first-time editors for the channel, Rock and His Mario. We were honestly on such a crunch to get this video out by the Game Awards, so I just was asking anyone who I knew who could edit to take segments of this video, and they all just showed up and did such an amazing job, so go ahead and give them some extra thank yous in the comments. But that's gonna be it for me. I don't know how many times I can say this video is over. This is probably like the third time. So thank you everyone, and I'll make more bear content soon, I promise.